consistently confusing for people is the question of legal separation. And a lot of people don't understand what legal separation is, and maybe we can go back a little bit to the next one, which is also annulment. But legal separation seems to provide a lot of confusion to people. They'll come in and they're saying, we're not living apart, we're legally separated. Can you tell us a little bit about legal separation?
Yes. Well, just because they're living apart doesn't mean they're legally separated. In order to be legally separated, you would file, instead of the petition for dissolution that we talked about before in order to institute or begin a divorce case, you would file a petition for legal separation. You go through the whole same time periods, the 6-day waiting period. You work out a division of your assets and your debts and parenting time for children. The difference really is that when you are divorced, when it's over, not divorced, you, instead of having a dissolution of marriage, you are legally separated. There's a decree of legal separation as opposed to a decree of dissolution.
Why would somebody get a legal separation as opposed to a divorce?
Well, there's a couple reasons. The one that comes up most predominantly in my experience is that in order to continue on as a dependent on one of the spouse's health insurance, if you're divorced, and let's say the wife, just to take an example, is being covered on the husband's medical insurance through his work, then if there's a divorce, she's no longer a dependent, the wife, and so she cannot be covered under the husband's medical insurance. If it's a legal separation, most policies will allow you to continue to be covered. So that's usually the driving force, is that if people need medical insurance, they don't want to pay what we call the COBRA premium, which is much more expensive, or have a hard time getting their insurance, and they're not going to get remarried right away, then they may consider doing a legal separation.
One thing I always caution people and myself is about pre-existing medical conditions. That's sometimes, you know, if you're going on COBRA in those situations, you want to be careful that you get insurance.
Yeah, I think the COBRA will allow you will stay on the policy up to 18 months, yeah. But thereafter, that's a good point. If you're going to get a new policy, you may have issues with that. So one other thing is that when you asked why people would want to have a legal separation as opposed to divorce, some people still may not be comfortable with the idea of saying they're divorced. So it just may be, even though that stigma is much less now than it was, say, in our parents' generation, it's easier for them to say, I'm separated, and it doesn't have the same ring to them that they're divorced. Now, if either party wants to change that legal separation into a divorce at any time, they can by just filing the appropriate papers.
Okay, that usually be when they want to remarry or something like that
right.
That changes it. What about annulment? Tell us a little bit about annulment.
Well, annulment is used not frequently, but it's the idea of saying that one of the parties has misrepresented themselves such that the other spouse married someone they didn't really think they were marrying. I mean, and the idea is to annul the marriage as though it never happened. This comes up, not that frequently, as I said, but it will come up where, for example, one of the spouses may be very religious in a particular religion, and the other spouse represented that they were a member of that same church or that same religion. And they get married and they find out later that they made that up. And that was very upsetting and very, very critical to the spouse who is of that religion in marrying that person. And that may be enough for them to say, you misrepresented yourself, I want to annul this marriage.
I mean, you mentioned a religious divorce at that point. Just the fact that you've got a civil divorce does not mean you've automatically gotten a religious divorce. Is that correct?
No, of course, those are entirely different. You have to go through whatever procedures the church or synagogue or whatever your religion is would require in order for that religion to recognize that the marriage is no longer going on.
Do you remember what the Jewish divorce is called?
I don't remember.
It's called a get. I always like that.
That's right.
The joke is you get a get. So I always found that interesting, but you don't see that too much. Arizona is a community property state. Can you tell us a little bit about community property and how that works?
Yes, you know, Arizona is one of only 8 states in the country that are community property states. Most of them, I think they're all in the West, going back to my law school days. And what community property is that all of the property there's a presumption that all of the property that is gathered during the marriage, during the time of the marriage, from the beginning of the marriage until the petition for dissolution is actually served on the other party, it's presumed that everything accumulated is from if it's from your earnings, is community property. So, for example, your earnings are during the marriage are in a bank account, that's community property. If the money that you made, it doesn't matter who, and you bought a house with it and both names are on there, it's community property or joint property. And so That's the presumption. Now, you could, what's not community property is that if your parents are nice to you and they gave a gift to you, not to both of you, but just to you, and put it in your own bank account under Wally's name and not your wife's name, that would not be community property. That would be what's called separate property. There's only two types, really. There's community or separate. So it's only what is accumulated during the marriage. And the same thing for debts.
What about property you had prior?
Property that you had prior remains separate property as long as you don't, let's say you had money in a bank account before you got married. And that is separate property. It is not community property because it's not property accumulated during the marriage. It's accumulated prior to the marriage. If you, however, take that money from the bank account, or you leave it in that account and you add your spouse's name to the account, it would then be considered joint property or common property. Same thing with the house. I've had this happen a number of times in my practice. I'm sure other lawyers have too, where one of the spouses had a home before the marriage, and then after the marriage they add the other spouse's name. Well, there's a presumption that you intended to make a gift to the community, and it then becomes community property or joint property.
Before I forget, let's you flash out on the screen again your information about you so that if anybody needs to reach you and get in touch with you, they can. How do debts fit into community property?
Well, debts are handled the same way. This presumption is that all the debts that are accumulated during the marriage are community debts. Now, like any other presumption in the law, you can what we call rebut the presumption or argue against it to show why it doesn't apply. For example, if you had a debt that was incurred that had nothing to do with the community, I don't want to get off color, but say one of the spouses had a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and they were.
It happens.
I've had this happen where they were paying for the rent for the apartment for their boyfriend or girlfriend. Well, that's not a community debt. It has nothing to do with benefiting the community. But in general, the expenses and debts that are accumulated during the marriage are presumed to be community debts, and each party is responsible for half of them, and that gets worked out in the divorce settlement.
I meant to ask you before when we were talking about children, let me come back to it now, is what happens if we have this parenting plan and one of the parents want to move out of state? What happens?
Well, there are certain requirements that if you're going to move out of state, that you give notice to the other spouse to give them a particular period of time to object and have an opportunity to go to the court and say this isn't fair. The spouse that wants to move shouldn't be allowed to move. And there's a procedure then for the court to hold a hearing and make a determination about whether or not that spouse who wants to leave with the children is allowed to leave with the children.
We're getting a little bit short on time. I know this is a big question, but can you tell us a little bit about spousal maintenance? Well,
spousal maintenance is what, like I said before, what we used to call alimony. And it's designed to provide generally, it depends on how long a marriage, but it's designed to provide a transitional amount of money paid by one spouse to the other to enable the other spouse to be able to get more education or increase their job ability. So if during the marriage, and this happens fairly frequently, one of the spouses makes a lot more money than the other spouse, and it depends, all these factors. If this is not like child support where you plug in numbers in a worksheet and it pops out how much money there should be paid as spousal maintenance. There's a lot of different factors that are taken into consideration, and actually spousal maintenance can be one of the most difficult aspects of a divorce, figuring out how much one of the spouse, if at all, how much should be paid for how long is not easy sometimes.
One quick last question. How do people choose an attorney? What's your recommendation on that?
Well, I think the whole idea of choosing an attorney is really based on someone you feel is not only competent in the law, understands the law, and can take you through the process, but it's really a partnership. You're working with your attorney on a pretty close basis could be an emotional, with divorce particularly an emotional kind of situation. It's someone you want to be comfortable with, someone that you feel you can call, you can talk to. You don't want to go to a lawyer, I wouldn't think, where you felt like you were being stupid if you asked a question that you didn't know, because that's, after all, why you're hiring a lawyer, is to help you in areas where you're not trained. And so I think it's not only competence, but someone that you feel comfortable with as well.
Good. I want to thank you for being my guest today. It's really been very informative. Time is running out, but we've been talking with Attorney Robert Michael Hersch about an introduction to divorce. We're going to be doing other shows, and he's coming back to talk to us later on about collaborative divorce. If you want to get more information about our show, you can always check out the website at the bottom of our page. And you've been watching Divorce TV with Wally Marcus.